You know, you wrote a sentence that is really foundational to how I think about politics, but I also think of it as an incredibly scary sentence. Basically that every time the president succeeds, it hurts the minority party. And every time the president fails, it helps the minority party.
The incentives definitely are against cooperation. If you support initiatives that the president proposes or cut a deal with the president such that both parties vote in favor of that proposal, it becomes hard to say why we should have a change in power. Layered on top of this intense two-party competitiveness has been a sorting out of constituencies, so that very few Republicans represent districts that went for President Obama. There's much less reason for politicians to look for ways to distance themselves from their parties by striking cross-party alliances. If you are coming to agreement, if you're cooperating, then it suggests to the public that things are working just fine. And it undercuts the whole logic of your campaign against the president or the president's party's continuation in office. So it confers legitimacy on the opposition party and on the power structure as it currently stands. There was a political scientist named Charles O. Jones who wrote about the Republican Party back in the 1970s, and he criticized the party for suffering from what he called a minority party mentality, meaning that they were reconciled to and expected to continue on in the minority. And he said that they were too willing to cut deals for little crumbs that they might get from the other party because that was all they could really expect to do.
That minority party mentality seems to be something that the Republican Party has solved.
It's lost, and Democrats, after Democrats lost their majorities, first 1980 in the Senate and then 1994 in the House, they never saw themselves as a permanent minority. That they always saw themselves as in striking distance of a return to power. And there was good reason for them to think that. The margin of control was narrow by historical standards. And so we've had two parties since 1980 and especially since 1994 that see themselves as potential majority parties. So we inhabit a remarkably two-party competitive period in American history. That every election holds out the possibility of a change in party control of one institution or another. This makes American politics more zero-sum than usual. This is not a normal set of circumstances in American politics. That it's been normal for us basically since 1980. But if you look at the broad sweep of U.S. history, say before the New Deal, after the Civil War, Republicans were the dominant party in American politics. After the New Deal and up through 1980, the Democrats were the dominant party. And so elections were a lot less interesting. Politicians were much less focused on elections during a time when there was less prospect for real change.
Right, if Mitch McConnell went to voters this year and he said, you know what, President Obama's done a pretty good job. He had a very reasonable stimulus, included a lot of tax cuts. We thought that was really terrific. We appreciated him reaching out like that. Obamacare, he really brought in a lot of our ideas into that law, the individual mandate, the use of private insurance, there's no public option. He's really done a good job reaching out. We've been proud to partner with him on these legislative initiatives. Vote for Republicans. That is not a pitch that would work.
It's almost laughable. If the minority party consistently bargains with the administration to come up with proposals that both parties can support, then what's their case for a change of power? How do they make their case?
There's an interesting tension, I think, in Washington, where we treat politics as a kind of an epic drama in which the president is the lead actor. And people want to see things happening from the president. If people care about immigration reform, they want the president to lead on immigration reform. If they care about the budget deficit, they want the president to lead on the budget deficit. And an implication of your research, something you actually say directly, is that for the president, doing what people think of as leading, going public, making big speeches, getting people excited, that can actually be harmful to passing his agenda, because the more the president associates himself with an idea, the more important it is for the minority party to make sure that idea doesn't pass, because if it does pass, and particularly if it passes with their help, then it will be popular, the president will be seen as successful, and the majority party will be likely to make gains in the next election.
The president is the single most understandable symbol of national government for the broad public. And so that's, to a great extent, how the public interprets Washington politics. You know, is the president doing well or not doing well? So that the reason why the news media embraced that particular approach to covering Washington politics is because it fits very well with how Americans think about, it makes sense of what's happening in Washington.
Why do you think then that we are so bad at picking up on this pattern? It is completely predictable the way this goes. You begin with an issue. There's a lot of talk of maybe something getting done, and then eventually the issue polarizes as the two parties kind of figure out their positions on it. And yet in Washington, among people who watch politics every single day, there is an utterly omnipresent belief that if only the president or the majority leader or somebody acted correctly, then cooperation would be possible. Cooperation is always just out of our grasp. We don't think of it as something that the system really doesn't allow. We think of it as something that individual actors fail to achieve.
Right. You know, many of the leading lights, opinion leaders of Washington grew up in a time where the parties were less competitive and less sorted out. There were more incentives for politicians to engage in some cross-party negotiating, so that they look back with nostalgia to that time, and they assume that we can get back there, that the idea that there's something in the system that gets in the way of that is not an attractive thing to think about. It suggests that the system itself may not be self-correcting.
So this is, I think, a really important point in your research, that American politics has, in fundamental ways that really matter, changed over the last 40 or 50 years. That the American political system of 1960, of 1970, maybe even of the early 80s, where famously Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan were having drinks, that is not the system we have today.
It's easy to see from a variety of indicators. One way is, every time we hold a presidential election, we see this red-blue map. That is not historically how presidential elections used to look. It used to be far more common for a single presidential candidate to win all across the country. Then that would make it much easier for him to then seek out and get cross-party support, because many of the members of the opposing party represented states and districts that went the other way and voted for the president. As we've become more geographically polarized, we don't have politicians who have reasons to look for ways to blur the party lines. Instead, they have more reason to dig in and differentiate themselves. When Obama's contrasted with LBJ, for example, people often forget that Democrats had roughly 2-to-1 margins over Republicans during that period. The highly productive Great Society Congress, and even though many of those Democrats were conservative Democrats, they had a political interest that they shared in not humiliating a president of the Democratic Party.
So we've talked so far here about the theory. And one of the interesting things about your work is I think you've proved this theory in a really clever way. You looked at non-controversial issues. You looked at things like whether we should send a man to Mars. Could you sort of outline some of that research, how it worked and what you found?
When the president takes a stand on an issue, that to some extent makes it a partisan issue. When presidents give a State of the Union address, the opposing party in Congress goes line by line looking for opportunities to rebut it. The parties will come together in opposition to the president on issues where there had not previously been clearly defined party lines. Or you can even see situations where the parties completely reverse positions based on who controls the presidency. Over the period that I was looking at this very closely in the 1990s and early years of the George W. Bush administration, the contrasts in the way in which the parties behaved on issues of testing in schools was quite remarkable. You might recall that Democrats were very strongly against No Child Left Behind, and they ran against that more or less the whole time that George W. Bush was in office. If you go back to when President Clinton was in office, Clinton proposed a less ambitious version of No Child Left Behind. And it was Republicans who opposed testing. Local control of local schools was the watchword, and Democrats supported the president on those issues. So it's very easy to take positions as inevitable, that opposing No Child Left Behind, well, that's just the liberal position, as if it was set in stone, because Democrats were largely doing that through the George W. Bush years. Notice we've heard very little about No Child Left Behind since the George W. Bush years, much less focus on that among Democrats as it became less useful as a cudgel against an administration.
Well, this is actually one reason that I sometimes get frustrated by the labels conservative and liberal. Right now, if I say somebody's a liberal, you know what I mean. But over any even reasonably short period of time, it becomes much more complicated. That today, a liberal is somebody who thinks the individual mandate is a constitutional idea, and probably a good idea. And a conservative is someone who thinks the individual mandate is an absolutely abhorrent affront to the Constitution. Whereas in 1994, a conservative was someone, in many cases, who supported the Senate Republican plan. It was the alternative to Bill Clinton's healthcare plan that had an individual mandate in it. And a liberal thought that was a pretty ridiculous way to do healthcare, demanding that people buy private insurance. And you see it on the NSA that in the Bush years, the idea of broad-based surveillance was something liberals and Democrats in general were appalled by. And if you actually look at polls around sort of surveillance, currently folks who self-identify as liberal are more comfortable with it than folks who self-identify as conservative.
Right.
And so liberal and conservative end up shifting around. And what a liberal believes now is maybe not what they believed 10 years ago, or a conservative now is not what it was 10 years ago. And I find it genuinely frustrating.
Yes, I do too. This is just the natural way party politics plays out.
And this is where I think where political science begins to move into political psychology. Of every explanation for human behavior in Washington, the most overused, in my view, is cynicism. Almost nobody ever, no politician, no staffer, and I don't want to say never, literally never, but almost never, walks out and takes a position they believe is wrong. Because it feels bad to do that. And people don't like to feel like scummy used car salesman politicians. They come up with highly complex reasoning and rationalizations for why it's right. But nobody ever says, I am for this because in the next election I would like my party to win. People are only for things because having done a thorough and honest look at the true evidence on this issue, any reasonable person would come to the conclusion that whatever I need to believe is the thing that is the correct thing to believe.
Well, governing is difficult and it involves trade-offs. And so any proposal that a president puts forward seriously, it's staffed out, a serious policy proposal, is going to involve trade-offs in one way or another. So as you look at it closely, and especially as you look at it with a skeptical eye, there will always be reasons to question. Political interests may prompt you to do this, but it doesn't take very long before you see the flaws in the president's proposal, and you can come to a considered judgment that those problems outweigh the benefits, and that we need to get a president of our party back in office.